Working the sermon, I found myself engaged less with my past than with our collective present. And so, in light of yesterday's events, one of which I just learned of after I got here this morning, there'll be a different and more serious tone to my remarks this morning than what I had intended. How to change the past. The past is history. But history isn't finished. And so it's the historical dimension and the faithfulness of history for our collective and individual lives that I want to emphasize this morning. In my introduction to this, my little blurb for it that I wrote, I used Faulkner's quote, "The past is not dead. In fact, it's not even past." But I'm going to speak much less to literature, to science, to other elements of this than I will to the historical today. More chillingly, consider this quotation from Winston Churchill: "History is written by the victors." In the last election, the winner, as determined by the electoral vote of the states of the United States and their electors, was Donald Trump. Donald Trump's campaign is to make America great again. And our racist-in-chief has been pursuing his mythological vision of that with a ruthlessness that many of us find not only disgusting, but horrifying. And so I invoke today the freedom of the pulpit, specifically to be able to address issues, rather than persons, issues that should not be controversial in any church pulpit in the United States. If I decry racism, if I decry gratuitous violence, I feel from an intellectual point of view that that is stupid, that it's even on the table to be discussed. And yet, given our times, the choices we're faced with in living through these things, much less trying to change our worlds, it seems to me that my topic, how to change the past, converges on this moment in history, as well as what I struggled and could not put together a little over a week ago, a sermon I wanted to do on democracy that you may see next week. As much as democracy is involved in these American events, which could not happen in any other country with this density of impact, as much as democracy is at stake in those things, what is at stake, what is driving much of this conflict, is how we inhabit our past and how our past inhabits and haunts our present and our prospects for our future. We are haunted by a past. When I wrote this sermon 15 or so years ago, I asked a question about the causes of the Civil War when I was talking about history. I said, are the causes of that war clear? That is way too tame and academic. It doesn't matter what the causes were. It doesn't even matter, really, what the war was about. I ask you today, when we talk about the past is history and the history of our past, of the Civil War, my question to you today is, who won? Who won the Civil War? There are certain elements in our country that, listening to them, you would think that the South won that war. And I mean not to disparage any region of the country, rather, but by one measure of history that I saw as a child, what was at stake in the Civil War was not only the practical de facto union of the states. It was not just, can we all live together as one country? But there was a difference of ideals about what people counted as full citizens and what people did not. And as I thought 15 years ago about the significant events of my past, and of what was at stake for me moving forward with my life, with my past, one of the things that struck me is that I grew up in a culture that I did not feel embodied my values, even though my culture preached my values. Many of you are familiar from issues of sexuality and gender with the phrase cisgender. I am cisgender. I am very much at home as a male. My driver's license matches my sense of myself, okay? I am not cis culture. For most of my adult life, American activities internationally and domestically have not articulated or put into play very well my sense of what it means to be an American, what my inner feeling of the ideal of America, what my patriotism as a child, as a student at William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia. Ever since then, my patriotism for America is not well reflected in the notion that America needs to be made great again. In any case, very little of this was going to be in my sermon this morning, and I took great pains to organize this into something with shape that I seem to have some difficulty disciplining myself to, so I will attempt that. In literary terms, with the example of Faulkner that I gave, literature is a good place to ease into the issue of how to change the past. Because one of the things that we can see through literature is the stream of consciousness that life is. We see that in Joyce, we see it in Virginia Woolf, but with Proust also, in Memory of Things Past, and some of the famous connections and symbolism there. It's a memory that starts that flood of consciousness. The memory of a taste of something in Proust begins that whole flood of everything being connected symbolically. So I want to suggest that in literary terms, literature that focuses on the symbolism, the stream of consciousness, the magical realism of Gabriel Marquez Garcia, those kinds of literary perspectives can remind us how much of our own interpretations of life are stories, as Carol was talking about. As Joan Didion wrote in one of my favorite lines, the opening of the White Album, we tell ourselves stories in order to live. They become our autobiographies. They become our sense of ourselves, just as Quentin in The Sound and Fury by Faulkner. But there are other examples from literature that show us how the past is subject to manipulation in different ways. And again, more chillingly, one of those is George Orwell's 1984. A world in which there were perhaps 3 superpowers, and the perspective of Oceania is that, okay, news event, we were at war with East Asia. We have always been at war with East Asia. And so the need for a political correctness in the sense that something will prop up the powers of the state and reinforce with rigid ideological hypnotism that every person has their view of reality to be exactly what Big Brother dictates, right? Other examples outside art. In science, the last century turned our notion of objective truth inside out. If we look to science for our sense of reality, and we look to physics as the kind of ground foundation of science, not only do we have Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, indicating to us that there is not a definite position and velocity of that particle at a point in time. The more we know about the position, the less we can know about the velocity, and vice versa. When we look at things as events, when we look at particles as time processes, one of the things that 20th century physics already taught us early in the century is that events are not even discrete, they're not bounded. And then we get the notion with black holes that events have a horizon. That on a black hole, the gravity is so intense that it sucks the events of all kinds within that horizon so that we cannot know anything about what happened. But there are certain symmetries that physics taught us, and we can know that when a particle-antiparticle pair is created, If half of that gets sucked into a black hole and we can see one half but not the other, we can make certain inferences about the other because of certain facts. But those are not Newton's laws. That is not science telling us of a mechanistic universe. The universe that Immanuel Kant lived in under Newton's laws, when philosophers were thinking such things in the Enlightenment era, was a universe that was everything determined by cause and effect. Everything well articulated. It was the universe of Laplace who said, if you had a demon who knew the position and vectors and velocities of everything in the universe, that computer, in essence, could predict the entire future. That is a universe in which the past is the predictor of the future, and not dead at all, but finished, because the future takes its own life deterministically. We live instead in a human world. We live in a world where the most important advances in human evolution, according to Yuval Harari, who wrote the best-selling book *Sapiens*, a kind of cultural anthropology in breezy, readable form. He says the greatest evolutions in human history have come from the human ability to create and believe what amount to myths. Consider, for instance, economics. Consider the evolution not from hunter-gatherer to agriculture, but consider what was involved in trade. There had to be currency, and currency meant that people had to trust that people would fulfill those obligations, which meant that people had to trust in abstract entities like nation-states. People had to trust in currency. Our mythology of the invisible hand of the market that guides all things for the best. Show me the invisible hand. It's in our psyches. When stock markets go up and down, why do they do that? When the stock market drops because people are somehow concerned about trade wars and tariffs, what's involved in that is the psychology of our belief in trading institutions. And Harari points out in *Sapiens* that those beliefs made possible the transformation of human culture much more fundamentally than the earlier transformation to agriculture had done. We live now in an information age where the rapidity and powers of computing are not only enabling us technological powers beyond what we've had before, but are far outstripping the myths and stories by which we live. And so Harari's point in the end of *Sapiens* and his books beyond that is that, hey, we're in need of real, powerful, deep, motivating stories about what's the point of our lives in an age where we're about, as Yang would observe in one of the Democratic debates, many of us are about to be replaced by machines, whether we know it or not, whether we understand that or not. In such a world that's evolving in those ways, where do we take our basis of meaning? So when I talk about changing our past, our future in some ways, our perception of our future, is driving us either to desperately hang on to a past that never was, to stave off a future we don't understand and fear, or to recover the ideals of that past in a way that we change the very meaning of where we've been by where we're going. Imagine you're Joe Biden. Joe Biden is not someone who came into these debates thinking that the past is changeable. I'll run on my record. I'm proud of these things. Yes, I've worked with segregationists across the aisle. Why does a man who has all those accomplishments and that public track record, and who has that level of support among progressives, among African Americans in particular, why does he find himself ambushed over things that he thought were settled and acceptable progressive histories? How does that happen? And the answer is that our expectations and perceptions in the present change what we expect you to do with your past. So perhaps as he improved from the first to the second debate. Perhaps Joe Biden will come out in the third debate and he will wear his past with more Obama in it and less shaking hands with segregationists in it. We'll see. At the same time, the realists are reminding us that the very progressive positions that are endorsed by the Elizabeth Warrens, by the Bernie Sanders, that are brought out in different ways by Cory Booker and Pete Buttigieg, for instance, that those are unelectable positions. And so we have, based on this past, a punditry that is telling us that certain ideals are too far out there to belong to American democracy at this time. So, let's go back to the Civil War. After Antietam, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. And he didn't want to do it until there was a Union victory of significance. Politically, he wanted that to come from a position of strength and not from desperation. The most important Union victory at Gettysburg yielded us the Gettysburg Address. And in Gary Will's brilliant analysis of the Gettysburg Address, he points out that Lincoln changed the framework of reference for the American democratic ideal. 87 years before Gettysburg was not when the Constitution was adopted. It was the Declaration of Independence. The ideals he was speaking to were not how many black people count as what percentage of a citizen for purposes of determining electoral votes and representation. He was not talking about the compromises of a system of checks and balances. He was talking about the ideals that drove the whole thing in the first place. Life, liberty, and the nowhere in the Constitution pursuit of happiness. When Lincoln did that, after Antietam, with the Emancipation Proclamation, he changed what that war was about. It was no longer just about, well, let's keep the states together. As he said at one point, if I could do that by freeing all the slaves, I would. If I could do it by freeing none of the slaves, I would. That was a very pragmatic thing for Lincoln. But once he did that, once the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, it changed what the war was, and therefore changed the whole complex of causes and meaning and significance. Flash forward from the Gettysburg Address and the appeals that Lincoln is speaking to the highest values of democracy. The surrender of General Lee. That would be the end of the Civil War, right? Well, sort of. We have Lincoln's ambitious plans for peace, and then we have Lincoln's assassination. Lincoln's assassination changed the end of the war, didn't it? And then, unlike recent times where we have uncontested elections in which there's no interference and everyone votes as appropriate to their right, in the election of 1876, between Hayes and Tilden, the turnout in South Carolina was 101%.
Well, that's interesting.
In a state where Republican voters, especially African Americans who were in the majority at that point, were harassed and intimidated. Two other southern states and one other was all kinds of controversy, and so they convened a convention to decide the election of 1876 between Tilden and Hayes, and the so-called compromise of 1876 or 1877, I guess it was, resulted in the Republican candidate, Abraham Lincoln's party, being named president, but the troops being withdrawn from the South, thus handing over to the South the freedom for the white Southern politicians to do as they please with respect to those situations. Now imagine in the title of another book, contemporary in nature. We were 8 years in power. Imagine that you were an African American in South Carolina in 1876 trying to go to the polls to vote. The federal troops have some presence there, and you've seen some instances of improvements through Reconstruction. Reconstruction had a very concrete meaning, not just an abstract personal significance. With the withdrawal of those troops then, imagine being returned to a kind of chattel status. It made everybody a Dred Scott. Think of it. It's as if they've been returned to a state of slavery. I shouldn't say everyone. I can't imagine what that would have been like.
Crushing.
So, what was the view of the past that one hears from the Southern Redeemers, who then got to tell the stories? If the victors tell the stories, if the victors write the history, once the federal troops left the South, we're still on my thread of who won the Civil War.
Right.
They unwon the Civil War. And people like Martin Luther King and Lyndon Johnson in different ways had to try to win it back. I grew up at a time where I could not believe that any fool, idiot, cretinous, moron, subhuman, nonsense, dickhead could possibly think that one human being had less citizenship value than another because of their race. That seemed just bizarre to me in a nation that proclaimed itself Christian. And so much of my not ciscultural growing up, much of my alienation, is a polite way to put it, from my culture, was simply on that point. If there's anything obvious, it's that all persons are created equal in some sense of that word. If there's any declaration of independence truth, if there's any point to democracy, surely it's that, right? And yet, you would think for many of our political pundits that the procedural freedom to bear arms is more important than who gets to vote or buy a house. And so that's the America I've grown up in. And so I can still ask, I think, who won the Civil War? Because there are people still fighting. So I will suggest at this time of a Democratic primary, at this time of turmoil and of real deep frustration and sadness for many of us, at the prospects and the profile of our great nation, I want to suggest that this Civil War is between the democratic ideals of Lincoln's Declaration of Independence and the redeemers of a mythological past. It's not about the position of molecules or particles. It's not about physics. It's not about determinism and relativism. It's about the human level of meaning in which we invest our lives with a sense of purpose. It's about the future versus a false conception of what the past ever was. But even our sense of the future draws on and transforms that past. Lincoln didn't say, well, starting today. No, he said 7 years ago. So I do, and I apologize for being somewhat rambling and unbalanced from the different things I wanted to get to here. I do want to get to the sense in which we can change the past. And so one of the things that we can do that changes the past is we unearth new information. When we find out something we didn't know before, it can change our sense of the past, and therefore our past can change as a result of that. Let me give you a trivial example, except it wasn't trivial to me at the time. I hope you all will still continue to have me in your pulpit occasionally, but I have to confess that when I was, 7 or 8 years old, I played doctor with a girl down the street one time.
We all did.
Yeah, but you didn't pretend to be a PhD. Now, anyway, but the reason I share that is I felt really guilty about that.
Right.
I was raised in a family and an environment where sexuality was like this, taboo is a good safe word. And so I felt that I had, in some sense, ruined that poor little girl out of the street. Well, you know what? It wasn't until I was in my 20s and I'm reading stuff on childhood development and that kind of stuff that I found out that it's kind of normal. I'm like, oh, that was kind of normal? And I'd forgotten all about it, but I had this sense of relief. So that's an example about how information that I get can change the past, just with new information. A more serious cultural example that relates to my larger weight of theme today is W.E. Du Bois, who, in writing the lives of black folks and in pressing for an awareness of black history and African American situations, may have changed many American Negroes' conceptions of who they were, where they come from, the whole Gauguin thing, where they might be going. By putting it in the context in which a person can take pride, it was no longer just, well, I won't go there. And so I think in that context, many of the different historical movements in America that have been central to African American life have, in the interest of pride and empowerment, been reclaiming the past from the mythology of the Ku Klux Klan, D.W. Griffith's The Birth of a Nation, Gone with the Wind, both the movie and the book. If you were making a list of the most influential movies in the history of the world, there's nothing more influential than Birth of a Nation. And Gone with the Wind probably had a bigger impact on the popular psyche than almost any other movie since. And so if our arts have perpetuated the wrong things, it's been up to our activist, scholarly, inspired, idealistic African Americans and their allies to revive that other story. If we're not going to make America great again, is the problem with America, is the problem with the again, is the problem with what it means to be great. And so, I'm going off track again. I meant to be on track. All right. I can change my past by finding new information. New information can let me gain a perspective on my past that I didn't have before. You know what? I came from a culture of advanced, civilized, caring, intelligent people that was pilloried, kidnapped, tortured, stolen, and enslaved. That's a different story. In that interpretation, and the shift of that interpretation, we can also shift within it, because of a shift in interpretation sometimes, how we feel about it. Imagine an African American who, well, I don't know anything, I can't read or write, I don't have a family because they're like someplace else, I can only do these things. I mean, imagine growing up that way, and imagine how hard it would be to feel pride in yourself, in your ability to accomplish something for yourself, not just pride that you ironed the napkins right for the master. So the feeling that a person has can be shaped by what she understands about who she is, where she's come from, and what that involved, because that can change her conception of what she might be capable of. And that's powerful. It's very important. It can change our feeling. One of the examples that I've given in other sermons and that I had meant to go into in more depth today is with trauma. And when someone is traumatized, it messes with her internal wiring of herself, the coherence she has of her own sense of self. her confidence in her ability to read other people and to see what's safe and unsafe in her world. All those things get thrown off. And yet, some different ways of dealing with trauma are able to access her understanding of her past, her locked-in, frozen responses to that trauma, and to let her move forward from there. So I want to suggest, in closing, that whether our locked into the past, whether the past that haunts us is personal or cultural, there are ways that we can access what those problem areas are, and there are ways that we can address them. One is by new information, one is by new interpretation and perspective, which can lead to more positive emotions, feelings, responses, ways of utilizing that. And most importantly, we change the past by adding to it. If I stand up in an AA, if someone stands up in an AA meeting and says, my name is John and I am an alcoholic, that person is acknowledging their past, but they're also making a commitment to an open disclosure and a process of moving forward from there that changes the meaning of being an alcoholic from the secrecy and the guilt and the other things to a very different kind of responsibility, depending on how they own that. And so I want to suggest that how we move forward is the decisive thing, whether we're Joe Biden or Elizabeth Warren or just folks hanging out in Palatka at a UU church, whatever and whoever we are. What lets us change our past the very most effectively is the steps we take as we flow into our future. Thank you.
Thank you.